The first mistake was believing the Queen of England had retired. A single, serrated sliver of lead, no larger than a florin, lay nestled in the silk lining of the Queen's mahogany writing box, smelling faintly of coal smoke and river water. It was not a bullet, not a coin, but a fragment of type, brutally ripped from a printing press, the edges sharp enough to draw blood from the white-gloved hand of Sir Henry Ponsonby, the Queen's private secretary. The note it accompanied was even colder than the metal. Only 3 words, scrawled beneath a crudely drawn map of the world, centered precisely over the heart of the British Raj. India is split. The entire package had been left anonymously on the royal barge, nestled under the royal standard like a poisoned pearl during the celebratory procession marking her return from the continent. Victoria, recently and triumphantly proclaimed Empress of India, was now standing in her private apartments at Windsor, having just read the message, and the stillness in the room was not the calm of peace, but the quiet of a coiled serpent. "A prank, ma'am, undoubtedly," Ponsonby suggested, his voice tight. The recent declaration of the Empress title, a direct maneuver by her beloved Dizzy, Benjamin Disraeli, had stoked the furnaces of every radical and republican paper in the kingdom. Such threats were cheap currency in 1877. Victoria did not look at him. She was standing beside the mantelpiece, her squat, black-clad figure dwarfed by the massive portrait of her late husband, Albert, which dominated the room. Yet in that stillness she commanded the space. She turned the scrap of lead over with a finger sheathed in black silk. "If this is a prank, Ponsonby, it is one executed with extraordinary precision. Note the paper, not cheap rag, high-grade linen, the kind used exclusively for official Foreign Office communiques. And the type fragment, it's Elsevier, used by Parliament's official printer for the most sensitive drafts of treaties and cabinet memoranda." Her eyes, famous for their penetrating blue, flicked up to his. Ponsonby swallowed, tracing the ridge of the scar he'd earned fighting in the Crimea, a conflict Victoria had always felt was bungled by incompetence. He knew this look. The widow of Windsor was gone. In her place stood a monarch whose grasp of global politics often surpassed her prime minister's. She had mourned Albert for 16 years, hiding her grief and her power beneath the heavy crape of perpetual widowhood. But the empire, always her truest love and deepest concern, had drawn her back out into the sunlit, dangerous corridors of influence. "The contents, ma'am. India is split," Ponsonby recited, forcing his mind to logic. Split by what? Rebellion? Famine? "Neither," Victoria stated, moving toward the vast, polished globe in the corner. She tapped the region of Afghanistan, the volatile, mountainous buffer zone between the British and Russian empires. "It means partition. It means treason. My viceroy reports that the Tsar's agents are growing bolder, pressing against the frontier. Disraeli is distracted by the Suez Canal debt and the Balkan crisis. Someone in London is making sure he remains distracted, carving up my jewel for delivery to St. Petersburg." Ponsonby's blood ran cold. The possibility of such high treason, a betrayal not by a Republican rabble-rouser, but by a member of the ruling elite, was terrifying. The scandal would not merely bring down the government, it could destabilize the throne. "Who, Your Majesty? Only a handful of men have access to the materials required to pull Elsevier type from the parliamentary press." "Precisely," Victoria said, a grim line tightening her lips. "A handful of men who walk Whitehall in silk hats, who dine at Brooks, and whose loyalty has grown too expensive or too weak. The Foreign Secretary, Lord Derby, is too cautious, bordering on timidity. The opposition, led by that tiresome moralist, Mr. Gladstone, smells blood and is ready to tear down Disraeli at the slightest sign of weakness. This plot is designed to provide that weakness."
She picked up the linen note again, holding it toward the window's strong afternoon light. The drawing of the map, though crude, was precise. The line marking the split was drawn directly along the Indus River Valley. The geopolitical implications were staggering. Control of the Indus meant control of the vital trade routes into the interior of India, effectively ceding the northwest to Russian influence. "I will inform Disraeli immediately," Ponsonby declared, reaching for his own dispatch box. Victoria's hand shot out, not touching him, but stopping his movement with the sheer force of her will. "No, Henry, not yet. Disraeli is under too much scrutiny. A formal investigation, ordered by him, would signal panic to the conspirators, driving them deeper underground. It would become a cabinet affair, and if this plot originates where I believe it does, the cabinet cannot be trusted." She paused, looking out at the foggy landscape of the Thames Valley, her mind tracing lines of loyalty and debt stretching back decades. The old queen was not merely a sovereign. She was a vast, deep repository of state secrets, personal vendettas, and compromised reputations. "I have kept my counsel for too long, mourning too publicly," she murmured, more to Albert's portrait than to Ponsonby. "The world believes I am a sentimental, aging widow content to stamp signatures and visit Osborne. They have forgotten how I fought my own uncles to ascend this throne. They have forgotten what the crown can do when it refuses to be merely ornamental." Victoria walked to a plain, unremarkable oak chest, one Ponsonby had always assumed contained old shawls or sentimental mementos, and unlocked it with a tiny silver key she wore on a chain beneath her bodice. Inside, nestled beneath a simple, unframed photograph of Albert, was a leather-bound book. It was not a prayer book, nor a diary. It was a private register, indexed by names of men who held influence, detailing their weaknesses, gambling debts, illicit love affairs, foreign entanglements, and secret loyalties. "This plot will not be undone by Parliament, nor by official police," she announced, her voice gaining a steely resonance Ponsonby hadn't heard since the death of Prince Albert. "It will be undone by my own instruments, by the people the crown pays but never acknowledges. You will send a coded message to Geneva. It is time to recall the Raven." Ponsonby stared at the book, at the name Raven, a legendary figure whispered about in the shadows of the Foreign Office, a fixer, an agent who only ever reported directly to the crown, last active during the Crimean War. He realized, with a rush of dread and exhilaration, that the Queen was not merely responding to a threat, she was initiating a counter-coup, conducted in the deepest, most dangerous secrecy. The great visible machinery of the British Empire was moving, but beneath it, the true source of power, the silent black-clad will of the Queen, had just begun to turn. The gloves were off, and the gloves were made of iron. "At once, Your Majesty," Ponsonby replied, picking up the small lead shard that had been the start of it all, recognizing it now, not as a threat, but as a call to war. The Iron Queen was back. She would not lose her empire.
The reaction from London was exactly as Queen Victoria had predicted, a dismissive drizzle of political cynicism. Sir Henry Ponsonby, having spent the early hours dispatching the coded telegram to Geneva, received the official reply from the Foreign Secretary, Lord Derby, just before the Morning Post. Ponsonby read the clipped, condescending note aloud in Victoria's sitting room at Windsor. His voice flapped with distaste. "Her Majesty's concerns regarding the recent anonymous communication are duly noted. However, the Foreign Office has assessed the artifact and judges it to be the work of a disgruntled printer, likely one of the many political agitators emboldened by Mr. Disraeli's recent imperial declarations. The suggestion of internal sabotage in service to the Tsar is, I must assure Your Majesty, entirely without foundation.
Her Majesty's time would be better spent focusing on the upcoming royal engagement in Leeds. Signed, Darby. Victoria, seated at her writing desk, her spectacles resting on her nose, listened without comment. She was meticulously examining the map of the Indian frontier that Ponsonby had retrieved from the Royal Geographic Society archives. A map so detailed it showed every mountain pass and river crossing. When Ponsonby finished, she gently pushed the letter aside with a small brass ruler. "Without foundation," Victoria repeated, her tone dry as old parchment. "Darby is a man who fears his own shadow more than he fears the Russian bear. He sees a minor inconvenience. I see a declaration of war. That is the fundamental difference between the politician and the sovereign, Henry. The politician seeks to avoid scandal. The sovereign must avert catastrophe." Ponsonby understood. Darby's dismissal was evidence that the plot was already working. If the conspiracy lay within the upper echelons of the Foreign Office, as Victoria suspected, then any inquiry ordered through official channels would be investigated by the very men who were guilty. The trail would vanish beneath a mound of paperwork and polite obfuscation. "The coded message, madame, was it sufficient for the Raven?" "It was sufficient," Victoria confirmed, reaching for a small, heavily detailed cipher book bound in faded red leather, a book that had not left her personal safe since the end of the Crimean War. The Raven was not a code name for a single person, but for a position. The Crown's private agent for affairs too delicate or too treasonous for official hands. The current incumbent, a man known only to Victoria and Albert as D.G., had been an invaluable intelligence officer during the Russian conflict, but had retired to the continent, weary of the corruption he witnessed in Whitehall. "His loyalty is to the memory of Prince Albert and the stability of the empire, not to this temporary government," Victoria explained, tapping the cipher book. "The message requested his immediate return and offered him only two assurances: full, untraceable funding and total authority. I have given him the cipher phrase, 'The north wind carries dust,' which he will use to contact you when he reaches England." "And the network, Your Majesty?" Ponsonby asked, referring to the delicate infrastructure required to support an independent espionage mission. She looked up, the corner of her mouth twitching in a rare, brief smile. "It is not a network, Henry, but a tapestry woven over 40 years. It is composed of those who owe me favors, who were disgraced by my ministers, or whose consciences demand service to the Crown above all else." She detailed the first 3 strands of this delicate web. First, Colonel Hastings, retired. An elderly military intelligence man, unjustly sidelined after criticizing the supply chain during the Abyssinian campaign. He was poor, bitter, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every military route and diplomatic dispatch concerning the Afghan frontier since 1842. He has the maps, Henry. Find him in Edinburgh and offer him a position restoring the Balmoral Library archives. Once he is there, he is yours to debrief. Second, Lady Sybil Beaumont, a prominent socialite and philanthropist who, beneath her frivolous exterior, managed the largest private charity for wounded soldiers in London. Her charity network provided her with access to key medical staff, journalists, and, crucially, dock workers and shipping manifests. She sees everything and hears everything in the slums and the ports that the Foreign Office refuses to acknowledge. She will track the money, the flow of funds that always precedes treachery. Third, Mr. John Brown's contacts. Her loyal Highland servant John Brown, though technically her personal attendant, held the confidence of a wide array of servants, stable hands, and keepers in the royal household and the great country estates. These were the invisible staff, who cleaned the desks and poured the sherry,
who heard the unguarded true conversations of the powerful. They see the late-night visitors, the unusual correspondence, the drunkenness, and the despair. Brown's network is the crown's ears when the palace doors are shut. Victoria stressed the most critical rule: total silence, total compartmentalization. None of them, not even Ponsonby, must know of the other contacts. You are the only node. The Raven will be the executive, but you, Henry, are the memory and the voice of the crown in this endeavor. Ponsonby's initial dread had given way to a quiet, focused determination. This was more than spy work. It was a psychological operation, designed to use the arrogance of the conspirators against them. They believed the crown was weak and sentimental. They believed they could hide their treason behind the anonymity of high office. The objective remains the identity of the English plotter and the physical evidence of his conspiracy with Russia, Victoria concluded, sealing the cipher book back in the oak chest. If we move too quickly, we risk panic. If we move too slowly, India is lost. We must allow the conspirators to continue their work, confident in their immunity, until the Raven has secured the evidence required to destroy them utterly. She rose, looking at the lead fragment again, now resting under a heavy glass paperweight. It was a trophy already, the first shot fired in a private war. The next day, Ponsonby dispatched messengers bearing innocuous letters. A letter inviting a retired colonel to visit the Scottish Highlands, another requesting Lady Sybil's charity provide services at a specific dockyard, and the final, most dangerous one, a single coded phrase sent across the channel to Geneva, seeking the man who operated best in the shadows. He checked his watch. The Raven would take at least 3 days to reach London. 3 days for the Crown's enemies to complete their delicate work. Ponsonby stared out the window, past the formal gardens, and toward the distant outline of Parliament, a monument of stone that was now, perhaps, rotten at its core. He had a sudden, terrifying premonition. The Raven was already on his way, but the plotters had already begun their climactic move. He heard the Queen's quiet, resolute voice from the other side of the room. "We wait, Henry, and we watch."
3 days. For Sir Henry Ponsonby, the time dragged like a lead weight being pulled through mud. He was stationed at Windsor, a silent sentinel monitoring the minimal, innocuous reports trickling in from the newly activated contacts. Colonel Hastings, hidden away in Edinburgh, had already begun cross-referencing old military dispatches, his coded correspondence peppered with increasingly frantic demands for specific, forgotten records. Lady Sybil Beaumont reported nothing yet, except for an unusual spike in the price of imported tea from Calcutta, a detail seemingly unrelated to high treason. The Raven, the Crown's legendary agent, had only just landed in Dover under a false identity. Ponsonby had received his coded confirmation that morning. "The north wind carries dust. I wait for the storm." The storm arrived at exactly 5:15 in the afternoon on the 3rd day, not with a bang, but with the sickening crunch of wood and metal against stone in the heart of Westminster. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, dizzy to the Queen, was returning from a particularly brutal debate in the House of Commons regarding the budget for imperial defenses. He was exhausted, but buoyed by a narrow victory that kept his government afloat. As his carriage, a sturdy, if slightly ostentatious private vehicle, turned onto Parliament Square, the accident unfolded with terrifying speed and precision. From a narrow side street near Westminster Abbey, a heavy coal wagon, apparently out of control, surged into the road. Disraeli's coachman, a seasoned professional, reacted instantly, wrenching the reins to avoid a direct, devastating impact. He succeeded in steering the carriage away from the main bulk of the wagon, but the momentum was too great. The heavy iron wheel of the coal wagon sliced into the rear axle of the Prime Minister's carriage with the sound like a gunshot. The Prime Minister's vehicle tipped violently, its wheels shattering against the cobblestones. The whole apparatus pitched sideways, coming to rest against a pillar of the old palace yard wall, the bodywork severely compromised, but the main compartment mercifully intact. The coal wagon driver, claiming to be terrified, immediately fled the scene, vanishing into the crowded London streets before police could question him. Disraeli, shaken but physically unharmed thanks to the quick thinking of his coachman, was pulled from the wreckage by stunned passerbys. Within the hour, the official story was printed on hastily rushed posters: tragic carriage accident in Westminster, Prime Minister escapes injury. When the official telegram reached Windsor, Ponsonby dismissed the initial report as mere mishap. Accidents were common in the congested streets of London. But then, a second, private telegram arrived, delivered by an agitated junior aide who had witnessed the scene. The aide's note was less about the accident and more about a small, unnoticed detail. The coal wagon was empty. Ponsonby stared at the single underlined word. Why would a coal wagon, designed to carry several tons, be used at speed on a wet street while empty? To carry an immense payload, it needed weight. To inflict maximum destructive impact, it needed momentum without the sluggishness of cargo. It was a battering ram, nothing more. He immediately ordered the royal train prepared and marched to the Queen's private sitting room. Victoria, alerted by the unusual flurry of activity, was already waiting, standing beside the mantelpiece, the lead fragment from the anonymous note still under the glass. She took the two reports from Ponsonby, reading the official version first, then the junior aide's terse addendum. She looked at Ponsonby, her face a mask of iron control. India is split, and now a perfectly aimed projectile disguised as an empty coal wagon? They knew the Prime Minister's route. They knew his schedule. They knew precisely where to apply the force for maximum damage. This was not a warning, Henry. This was the execution of the final phase. They intended to kill him, ma'am, Ponsonby whispered, the realization sinking in with terrifying clarity. If Disraeli had died, his government would have instantly collapsed. The ensuing political chaos, the funeral, the succession crisis, would have given the conspirators weeks, perhaps months, to finalize their arrangements with Russia completely unchecked. And who would take power, Henry? Victoria asked, her voice dangerously soft. That man of endless sermons and moralizing sermons, Mr. Gladstone. A man who loathes imperial spending, who despises Disraeli, and who would be so consumed by dismantling his predecessor's work that he would never detect a geopolitical plot beneath the budget sheets. The stakes were now catastrophically clear. The plot was not just treason, it was an attempt at governmental destabilization intended to irrevocably change the course of imperial policy. "We must activate the Raven immediately, ma'am," Ponsonby urged. "He must know the timeline has been compressed." "Indeed, and I must cease this pretense of grieving isolation," Victoria declared, moving with a sudden forceful energy that belied her age. She retrieved her travel bag. "Disraeli is shaken, perhaps internally injured, but he is alive. I will go to him, not merely as his sovereign, but as his shield." A visit by the Queen to an injured Prime Minister was an unprecedented, highly visible event, a signal to both friend and foe that the Crown was actively engaged. By stepping out of Windsor and onto the public stage, Victoria was drawing the eyes of the entire nation and, critically, the eyes of the conspirators. They would be forced to pause their internal plotting while they assessed the meaning of the Queen's sudden involvement. "You will proceed to London with me," Victoria instructed, fastening the black leather straps on her bag. "I will make a public display of support for Disraeli, which will serve two purposes: reassure the public and paralyze the plotters. Meanwhile, you will use the chaos around Westminster to make contact with the Raven. His arrival must be seamless, silent, and entirely unobserved by the official police, who will now be swarming the crash site. She fixed him with a challenging gaze. Tell the Raven that the game is no longer one of patient espionage, it is one of speed. He must identify the source of the funds and the nobleman who commands it before the political crisis that Derby is already fabricating can be completed. Go, Henry. Tell the driver to make haste. The Iron Queen is leaving her cage. As the royal train roared toward London, Victoria sat alone in her carriage, her hand resting on the smooth, heavy wood of the private chest that held her secrets. She had played the widow long enough. Now, for the sake of the Empire Albert had helped her build, she would play the executioner.
The royal train's arrival at Paddington Station was an event of orchestrated theater. Queen Victoria, who had spent the better part of 2 decades avoiding public fanfare, emerged from her carriage cloaked in the austere black of perpetual mourning, yet radiating an undeniable, focused energy. The public outpouring of emotion, concern for the Prime Minister, curiosity about the Queen, was exactly the shield Victoria needed. She was using the national anxiety as camouflage for a secret war. Her visit to the injured Benjamin Disraeli, confined to his house in Whitehall with severe bruising, was brief but powerful. She found him furious and defiant, already demanding to be propped up to receive dispatches. "They missed, ma'am," Disraeli rasped, his eyes bright with competitive fire. "They tried to decapitate the government, a clumsy criminal effort." "Clumsy only in execution, Mr. Disraeli, not in intent," Victoria countered, sitting beside his bed. She did not waste time on pleasantries. It was a message. They were seeking chaos to cover an internal maneuver. "I believe the plot is deep within the Foreign Office, where the rot always begins." She refrained from mentioning the "India is split" note or the Raven. She needed Disraeli alert, but not paralyzed by paranoia. He must believe this was a matter of state security, not a private war waged by the Crown. She gave him 2 directives. First, accept the official report of accidental oversight to prevent panic, and second, use his narrow victory on the defense budget to immediately and publicly demand increased military preparations in the Afghan region, forcing the plotters to reveal their hand by escalating their countermoves. "You, sir, are my target," she told him, her eyes steady. "If they failed to kill you, they must now discredit you. Expect attacks on your character, your funding, and your judgment." Disraeli, the master political strategist, grinned weakly. "Then we give them a grand show, ma'am. They want a crisis? I shall provide a magnificent one." With her public duty discharged and her Prime Minister fortified, Victoria executed her second move. She did not remain in London to be entangled in the official police investigation. Instead, she retreated to Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands, a place the political classes viewed as an isolated sanctuary of sentimental grief, but which Victoria saw as her true northern command post. The great distance from London provided an immediate, plausible excuse for Ponsonby to conduct sensitive communications without witnesses. It was in the drafty morning room at Balmoral that Victoria met with the man who would prove to be her immediate, most frustrating obstacle, William Ewart Gladstone. Gladstone, Disraeli's great rival, a man of relentless moral conviction and towering oratorical power, arrived at Balmoral not to offer sympathy, but to demand accountability. He had secured a private audience under the guise of concern for the Prime Minister's safety, but his true purpose was to press his advantage. "Your Majesty, this attempt on the Prime Minister's life, whether criminal negligence or something darker, demands a full, open parliamentary inquiry into the security of the Foreign Office and the processes for awarding supply contracts," Gladstone pronounced, standing stiffly before the Queen.
He carried a heavy air of self-righteousness, like a judge preparing to deliver a damning verdict. Victoria regarded him over the rim of her teacup. "Your Majesty, I understand your concern for security. The matter is well in hand." "With all due respect, Your Majesty, I do not believe it is," Gladstone pressed, his voice rising with conviction. "Disraeli's tenure has been marked by imperial excess and reckless spending. If this was a premeditated attack, it is symptomatic of a government that has lost its moral compass and its public trust. The people deserve transparency. We must tear down these walls of secrecy and corruption, or the very structure of government risks collapse." His words, meant to sting Disraeli, struck Victoria like a physical blow. Gladstone was unwittingly demanding an investigation into the very department, the Foreign Office, that was harboring the conspirator. A public inquiry would accomplish exactly what the coal wagon had failed to do: expose the political instability of the government, drive the conspirators into hiding, and possibly even force the Queen to reveal her private knowledge. "There will be no public inquiry, Mr. Gladstone," Victoria stated, her voice low and dangerously final. Gladstone, unaccustomed to such blunt refusal, stiffened further. "Your Majesty, I must insist. My duty to the Crown and to the nation compels me to seek the truth, no matter how politically uncomfortable it may be for the current administration. We cannot afford cover-ups. We must root out the malcontents." "You speak of rooting out malcontents, sir, when you are precisely distracting the proper authorities from their task. There is a private investigation underway, one that will address the roots of this incident, not merely the rotten leaves of political grievance. Your interference, however well-intentioned, risks destroying the fragile intelligence operation already in motion." Gladstone, sensing the depth of the Queen's conviction, momentarily faltered. It was highly unusual for the Queen to admit to any form of private investigation. He realized this was not about Disraeli's governance. It was about the security of the throne itself. As Gladstone departed, chastened but still deeply suspicious, Ponsonby arrived with a dispatch. The Raven was in London, had met Lady Sybil, and had already identified the key to the conspiracy: a disgraced Foreign Office clerk known for his crippling gambling debts. The thread was now connected to a specific, vulnerable person. Victoria, watching the fog roll in over the loch, felt the chilling weight of her isolation. She had successfully deterred Gladstone, protected Disraeli, and established her command post. But the nobleman, the unseen architect of the treason, now knew she was watching him, and she knew he was financing the plot. The next step was to pull the string and pray the clerk did not snap before he spoke.
The rendezvous was a deserted, fog-choked warehouse in the sprawling docklands east of the Tower, a location far removed from the polite society of Whitehall. For Mr. Elias Thorne, a low-level clerk in the Foreign Office until his hasty, debt-fueled departure, it was a cold, final stage of ruin. Thorne sat huddled beneath the single bare gas lamp, clutching a hat that had once been respectable. His face was pale and slick with anxiety, the fear of arrest and public disgrace heavier than the cold that seeped into his bones. Facing him was the Raven. The agent was nondescript, dark coat, soft-soled boots, but his eyes, devoid of judgment yet relentlessly analytical, held the clerk captive. "You understand why you are here, Mr. Thorne," the Raven stated, his voice a quiet rasp that carried an immense weight of authority. "We know about the discrepancies in the Constantinople dispatches. We know about the delays in the Afghan supply orders. And we know about the ruinous debt you owe to the bookmaker in Covent Garden, a debt that mysteriously vanished 4 months ago." Thorne whimpered, pressing his hands to his temples. "Please, sir, I paid it. I borrowed. From a private source.
It was merely a lapse of judgment. I am no traitor. Treason is rarely committed by men who believe they are traitors, Thorn. It is committed by men who believe they are merely saving their lives or their reputations. You were offered salvation, and in return, you offered the one thing you possessed: access to the Crown's sensitive correspondence. The Raven produced a small silver-framed photograph of a dignified older man, Thorn's father, a respected magistrate who had died penniless, leaving Thorn his name and nothing else. Your father's reputation remains intact. The moment the courts learn you took bribes to jeopardize the lives of British soldiers, that reputation will be destroyed. The Queen does not prosecute men who cooperate. She executes those who refuse. The implied threat, delivered with chilling calm, broke Thorn's last defense. He began to speak, the words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and self-pity. "The Nobleman," Thorn stammered, pulling the name from the shadows where he had kept it. "He never gave me his name, only the promise of rescue. He was immensely rich. He found me at my lowest, through a connection at my club. He paid the bookie, settled the notes, and asked for nothing immediate, only small, inconsequential favors in the Foreign Office." He described how the favors escalated. It started with simple delays. Ensuring a vital dispatch detailing troop movements to the Afghan frontier was routed to the wrong desk for 3 days. Then it became sabotage, substituting an old, flawed treaty draft for a current one just before it was filed for cabinet review. These acts were subtle, easily attributed to bureaucratic incompetence, yet their impact was strategically devastating, weakening the government's position both at home and abroad. "And the money, Mr. Thorn. Who financed the Nobleman?" "English money," Thorn insisted, trembling, "not foreign gold. His wealth was colossal. It came from shipping, sir, and rail investments, not state funds. He spoke constantly of leverage and financial control. The Russian business, that was secondary. He said Russia's gain was merely a profitable consequence of his true aim, breaking the East India Company's final holds on trade. The Nobleman, Thorn explained, wasn't a true Russian sympathizer. He was a cold, calculating capitalist who saw the empire as an archaic obstacle to his personal global trade dominance. By allowing Russia to destabilize the northwest frontier, he could devalue established British trade routes, acquire massive investments cheaply, and corner the market on critical goods funneled through the Persian Gulf. The political chaos created by Disraeli's potential death would merely facilitate a rapid, irreversible financial transaction. He also funded the Reform Leagues, Thorn added, desperate to offer everything he knew. He used his money to purchase influence with radicals, men who loudly demanded an end to imperial overreach. They thought he was their political benefactor, pushing for reform. But he was just creating a smokescreen. The chaos of revolution was merely a business opportunity for him. The Raven listened, synthesizing the information. The plot was far more dangerous than simple treason. It was a fusion of global finance and political sabotage, cloaked in the acceptable language of reform and budget cuts. The perpetrator was an English nobleman with vast, untraceable private wealth, leveraging political ideology for commercial gain. He was not only powerful enough to manipulate a Foreign Office clerk, but rich enough to silence him permanently if the need arose. The Raven concluded the interview quickly, securing Thorn's cooperation by promising him transportation and a small stipend for silent exile in the colonies, far from the reach of the nobleman's revenge. A coded dispatch was immediately sent to Balmoral via Ponsonby. It contained no names, only descriptors. Subject is a nobleman of immense liquid wealth. Motive is financial dominance over Indian trade routes, masked by political collusion with St. Petersburg. He commands influence across both high society, shipping, rail, and fringe political groups. reform leagues. Queen Victoria received the report late that night, the chilling truth illuminated by the oil lamp. It was not a faceless conspiracy, but a single, supremely powerful traitor who moved through the highest ranks of her society, using the very mechanisms of British commerce to undermine the empire. She now knew the profile of her enemy, a financial puppet master. Queen Victoria opened the ancient ledger, the register of favors and weaknesses. She did not need a name, she needed an address, a title, and a financial weakness that could match the depth of his ambition. The hunt for the nobleman was now a deadly, focused pursuit.
The nobleman, confident in his own immunity and now alerted to the Queen's public defense of Disraeli, made his expected countermove. He didn't attack London, he attacked the periphery, where the British Empire's hold was most tenuous, Constantinople. The Ottoman capital was the nexus of the current geopolitical crisis, the pivot point where British and Russian interests collided over the crumbling Turkish control of the Balkans and the crucial trade routes. Victoria's greatest concern was the nobleman's funding stream, and the trail, established by Lady Sibyl's port contacts, led directly to a minor British diplomatic official stationed there, Mr. James Hawthorne. Hawthorne, a zealous but naive young man, had been recruited by the Raven on his way through Europe. His task was simple: monitor the clandestine telegram traffic between the Russian embassy and a specific large London shipping firm, confirming the financial transactions that would indict the nobleman. The problem arrived via a frantic, badly coded telegram received by Ponsonby at Balmoral. Hawthorne had been compromised. Hawk circled. Nest exposed. They move on the documentation tomorrow. Cannot retrieve without full exposure. The Raven had left enough information in the cipher for Victoria to understand the gravity of the situation. Hawthorne, in his zeal, had been spotted making contact with a known informant for the British Embassy. The nobleman's agents, alerted by the subtle pause in the Foreign Office sabotage, had swept the area and identified Hawthorne as a threat. The documents Hawthorne possessed, physical proof of the nobleman's funding of the Afghan revolt, were now locked in his consulate safe, inaccessible without triggering the Turkish police and, inevitably, the nobleman's political connections. If the Raven attempted to extract Hawthorne and the evidence simultaneously, the ensuing diplomatic incident would reveal the secret nature of the Crown's operation, forcing Victoria to publicly explain why her private agent was conducting espionage in a supposedly friendly capital. This would give Gladstone the ammunition he needed for a full parliamentary inquiry, exactly as the conspirators had planned. The investigation would be dead. Victoria stared at the telegram, the heavy air of Balmoral feeling suddenly thin and cold. She had to choose between the life and reputation of a loyal agent, Hawthorne, and the preservation of the entire delicate investigation, the only pathway to saving India. Ponsonby watched his queen. She was no longer simply reading, she was calculating the moral cost of victory. "Who is Hawthorne's primary loyalty?" Victoria finally asked, her voice steady. "To the Empire, Your Majesty," Ponsonby replied instantly. He joined the service with a near-romantic fervor for duty. He is utterly naive about the cost of that duty. "Then he will pay it," Victoria declared, the words cutting through the silence. She picked up her pen, dipped it in ink, and began writing on a fresh sheet of Foreign Office paper, addressing the dispatch not to the Raven, but directly to the British ambassador in Constantinople. The message she drafted was cold, precise, and ruthless. It accused Mr. Hawthorne not of treason, but of an egregious, fabricated crime, misappropriation of funds, and an illicit affair with a high-ranking Turkish official's wife, a diplomatic scandal that would be ruinous to his reputation,
but would explain his sudden departure and arrest as a matter of moral failure, not espionage. The instructions to the ambassador were clear. Publicize the scandal immediately. Ensure Hawthorne is arrested by the Turkish authorities for disturbing the peace, and, most critically, use the resulting chaos to discreetly retrieve and destroy all documents from Hawthorne's safe, except for the financial ledgers related to the London shipping firm. The Raven would use the subsequent diplomatic noise to slip into the city and secure the financial proof. "We are sacrificing him, ma'am," Ponsonby stated, his own moral center reeling from the calculated cruelty of the move. "We are making him a distraction, Henry," Victoria corrected, signing the dispatch with an unblinking hand. "His integrity is the price of the Empire's survival. If the plotters believe they have eliminated a political threat, they will cease their search. They will not suspect the true intelligence. The financial ledgers have been secured by the Raven." The sacrifice was necessary to maintain the secret of the investigation. Hawthorne's disgrace would be a delicious piece of gossip for the London drawing rooms, confirming to the nobleman that the threat had been neutralized by the very incompetence he relied upon. No one would ever suspect the Queen had orchestrated the downfall of her own agent to protect her own spy. The dispatch was sealed and sent by express courier. Minutes later, a brief, coded reply arrived for Ponsonby from the Raven. "Proof secured. I proceed to the next node. Price paid." The Raven had retrieved the evidence, the physical ledgers linking the nobleman's shipping company to the Russian financing of the Afghan rebels, just hours before the fabricated scandal broke. Victoria stood and walked to the window, the Scottish mountains looming grey and unforgiving in the afternoon light. She felt no remorse, only the dull, heavy pressure of duty. Hawthorne's life, Hawthorne's reputation, these were mere counters in the grand game of nations. Her priority was the survival of the Empire, and sometimes the most essential act of preservation was betrayal. She had secured the nobleman's motive, Chapter 5, and now she possessed the proof of his funding, Chapter 6. The next phase, she knew, would be the most personal and dangerous. The nobleman's attack on her family. She had paid a moral price abroad. Now she prepared for a personal price at home.
The nobleman, having failed to kill Disraeli and realizing his Constantinople pawn had been sacrificed, understood precisely who his true adversary was. It was not the government he battled, but the formidable secret will of the Queen herself. His counterattack, therefore, was not aimed at policy or politics. It was aimed at Victoria's deepest vulnerability, her children. The target was Prince Arthur, the Queen's third son, a military man with a fatal weakness for grand but risky investments in mining schemes and colonial development. Arthur was not malicious, but he was chronically careless with money, having amassed a series of crippling, high-interest personal debts that dwarfed his royal allowance. These debts were known only to a few nervous financial advisors and, critically, to the nobleman, who had acquired the most damaging promissory notes through shell corporations. The nobleman's strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. Leverage the debt to force Victoria to halt her investigation by threatening to expose a scandalous royal bankruptcy. The news arrived at Balmoral in the form of a formal letter from a prominent London solicitor, addressed directly to Ponsonby. The solicitor, acting on behalf of an anonymous client, politely informed the Queen's private secretary that Prince Arthur's debts were due immediately. Failure to meet the substantial sum would result in the forced liquidation of the prince's assets, and more ruinously, a public declaration of bankruptcy, a humiliation not seen in the royal family for centuries. Ponsonby brought the solicitor's letter to Victoria, who was meeting with Colonel Hastings to review old maps of the Khyber Pass. Hastings, now fully immersed in his new role, was muttering about the deliberate misrouting of certain heavy artillery shipments decades ago. Victoria listened to Ponsonby read the letter, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she tapped the letter's crest. "The Nobleman," she said, her voice flat. "This is the price of Hawthorne's sacrifice, a perfectly targeted piece of blackmail." "It is not merely the money, ma'am. It is the scandal. A public bankruptcy for a prince would be seized upon by Gladstone and the Republicans. It would suggest profligacy and incompetence at the heart of the crown. It would be an irresistible tool to discredit the entire system of royal allowances and the Queen's judgment." The timing was impeccable. The news would break just before Parliament was due to vote for a crucial extension of Disraeli's imperial funding bill, the very measure the nobleman wished to destroy to open up the trade routes. If Victoria chose to pay the debt secretly, she would be emptying the Crown's private reserve, risking her future financial independence, and worse, implicitly negotiating with a traitor. If she chose to expose the nobleman, the ensuing treason trial and royal scandal would create a political earthquake, destabilizing the government and achieving the same goal, sinking the imperial funding bill. "We are cornered," Victoria acknowledged, pushing the maps aside. "He has found the intersection where my duty to the crown and my loyalty as a mother become a weapon against me." The Raven, having secured the ledgers in Constantinople, immediately returned to London. He sent Ponsonby a frantic, detailed cipher that confirmed the danger. The nobleman was indeed using Arthur's debt as leverage. Furthermore, the nobleman had begun actively cultivating political allies on the backbenches of Parliament, using the manufactured crisis to whip up opposition to Disraeli's upcoming vote. "The nobleman is mobilizing his parliamentary forces," Ponsonby relayed. "The debate on imperial funding is set for 5 days from now. If Arthur's scandal breaks first, the bill fails. If the bill fails, the forces on the Afghan frontier are cut off, and the nobleman wins his geopolitical maneuver." Victoria summoned Prince Arthur to Balmoral. She did not yell or weep. She simply laid the solicitor's letter before him. Arthur, pale and ashamed, confessed to the full extent of his recklessness. "I was assured, Mother, that the bonds were safe. The mining venture was supposed to be extraordinary," he stammered. "Extraordinary only in its capacity for destruction, Arthur," she corrected him severely. "You have allowed yourself to become the weakest link in the defense of my empire. Your debt is not merely a financial failing, it is a threat to the nation." Victoria was faced with an impossible calculation: the life of the empire versus the public integrity of her family. She realized that the nobleman did not want the money. He wanted the Queen's immediate surrender. He wanted her to call off the Raven, to allow the funding bill to fail, and to retreat back into silent widowhood. "We will not pay the debt, Henry," Victoria decided, her gaze locked on the gloomy Scottish sky. "Your Majesty," Ponsonby gasped, "the scandal, it will be catastrophic." "A catastrophe of reputation, yes, but a catastrophe of reputation is recoverable. A catastrophe of empire is not," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "We will allow the solicitor to issue his warning. We will allow the London papers to begin sniffing at the edges of the prince's indiscretion. But we must buy time. Arthur must publicly retire to the continent for a period of ill health. We will leak a sanitized story that the debts are being addressed through private familial means, enough to slow the wolves, but not enough to appease the nobleman." The sacrifice was now personal. She was allowing her son to be publicly disgraced and driven into exile to preserve the secrecy of her operation and the solvency of the government. "The Raven must now move on the nobleman directly," she commanded. "He has the motive and the funding proof. He must secure the nobleman's identity and location within the next 4 days. I will face the House of Commons myself to save Disraeli's bill. But I must know who I am fighting. I must know his name." The nobleman, enraged by the Queen's refusal to surrender to his blackmail regarding Prince Arthur's debt, and mistaking Arthur's quiet retirement for a temporary reprieve rather than a permanent sacrifice, activated his final, most destructive phase. The target was the northwest frontier, the volatile, mountainous gateway to India. Colonel Hastings, working feverishly from Balmoral, had provided the key insight. Reviewing his old, neglected dispatches, he discovered a historical pattern. Every successful raid into the Peshawar Valley over the last 20 years had depended on securing a single, isolated mountain pass known as the Coast Gap. This pass was traditionally guarded by a small, allied tribal militia, whose loyalty was maintained by a modest annual subsidy from the Crown. The intelligence the nobleman had received from his network confirmed that this year's subsidy payment had been deliberately delayed. A bureaucratic error, or so it was officially recorded. In reality, the nobleman had used his shipping ties to intercept and reroute the payment, funneling a much larger sum of Russian-backed gold to a rival, fiercely anti-British tribal leader in the adjacent valley. The result was immediate and catastrophic, a swift, brutal uprising. A coded telegram, marked "Urgent, Eyes Only," reached Balmoral from the Viceroy in Calcutta late on a rainy Tuesday. It reported a coordinated assault by hostile tribal forces on the British-aligned militia guarding the Coast Gap. The Allied forces had been overwhelmed and massacred. The gap was open. The news was being suppressed by the Viceroy, who feared a public panic, but the military implications were dire. The Russians now had a fully funded, locally supported proxy force strategically positioned to cut off vital supply lines to British garrisons. The attack was precisely timed. The news of the frontier disaster would reach London in full official detail just 12 hours before the crucial parliamentary vote on Disraeli's imperial funding bill. The nobleman had calculated that the ensuing national outrage over the betrayal and loss of life would crush the bill, proving Disraeli's government incompetent and reckless, and forcing a political collapse that would benefit the nobleman's financial schemes. Victoria, huddled with Ponsonby and Colonel Hastings in the Balmoral drawing room, felt a surge of cold, focused fury. The enemy was no longer a shadow. He was a murderer, using the map of the empire as his chessboard. "If the bill fails, the garrisons starve," Victoria stated, her gaze fixed on the map of Afghanistan, where the Coast Gap was now a dangerous, gaping hole. "We have sacrificed Hawthorne, disgraced Arthur, and saved nothing. The crisis must be contained before the vote, Henry. We must show strength to deny the nobleman the chaos he requires." "Disraeli cannot deploy reinforcements without the funding bill passing, Your Majesty," Ponsonby countered, running a hand through his hair. "The logistics are locked. Even if he could, a full military response would take weeks." "Then we do not use Disraeli's resources. We use my own," Victoria declared. Colonel Hastings, who had spent his career lamenting the loss of Britain's true private agents, immediately understood the Queen's intent. "The Royal Guard, ma'am, a small symbolic force." "No, we send the Raven," Victoria announced. The Raven, currently operating in London, had just transmitted his final vital piece of information: the full identity of the conspirator. It was Lord Alistair Pembroke, a man of immense shipping wealth, an outspoken reformer, and a distant cousin to half the nobility. The very name confirmed the depth of the treason. Victoria's plan was breathtaking in its audacity and illegality. She would authorize the Raven to lead a small private military envoy to the frontier, financed entirely by the Crown's secret purse. This envoy would consist of a dozen former Gurkha and Sikh officers, whose loyalty was to the Crown and whose expertise lay in asymmetrical mountain warfare. Their objective was not to win a battle, but to execute a precision strike, destroy the rebel arms caches,
secure the coast gap with their lives if necessary, and send back a single coded message confirming the action before the vote. This mission would be wholly unauthorized by Parliament, bypass the War Office, and directly contravene the chain of command. If discovered, Victoria would face accusations of high-handed rule, military adventurism, and usurpation of governmental authority. "The Raven will need full command authority, ma'am," Ponsonby warned, pale at the thought of the risk. "We are essentially waging a private war." "Then give it to him," Victoria commanded. "Draft the order immediately. Codename Operation Iron Hand. He is to depart London within 4 hours. Tell him his mission is not to fight the Tsar's army, but to deny Lord Pembroke his victory." While Ponsonby frantically scrambled to secure the funds and send the coded orders, Victoria penned a personal letter to Disraeli. She instructed him to delay the vote by exactly 12 hours, citing a procedural technicality, and to use the interim to prepare an impassioned, belligerent speech, focusing on the honor of the British soldier, not the technicalities of the budget. She needed the focus on emotion and national pride, not on military logistics. The Queen stood by her window, looking toward the distant south, where London lay in a fever of political maneuvering. Lord Pembroke had played his last, highest card, mass murder and imperial collapse. Victoria had played hers, a secret, unauthorized war led by a phantom agent. The clock was ticking toward the final, desperate climax. Victoria knew she had won the espionage war, but she still had to win the political war in Westminster, and that required a physical victory, however small, on the far-off, deadly Afghan hills. She had sacrificed everything. Now she would fight for everything.
The political atmosphere in Westminster was toxic. The official reports regarding the massacre at the Coast Gap had landed, creating a frenzy of national grief and political finger-pointing. Lord Alistair Pembroke, now identified and operating in the open, used his carefully cultivated network of reformist and anti-imperial politicians to demand an immediate end to Disraeli's disastrous adventurism. His allies argued that throwing more money at the frontier was merely funding failure. The Imperial Funding Bill, crucial for sending emergency supplies and reinforcements to the besieged garrisons, seemed certain to fail. Disraeli, following the Queen's instruction, had secured a 12-hour procedural delay on the final vote. He was exhausted and under immense pressure, but held the line, preparing the impassioned defense Victoria had demanded. But Victoria knew a speech, however brilliant, would not be enough. She needed a dramatic, impossible intervention to swing the moderate votes, the uncertain members of Parliament who feared both Russian encroachment and royal scandal. She needed to remind Westminster exactly who was in command of the empire. The Queen, having traveled overnight from Balmoral under the cover of a dense fog, arrived at Westminster Palace at dawn. Her presence alone was electrifying. She did not enter the public gallery or the House of Lords. She took up temporary residence in the Speaker's private chambers, a location of immense symbolic power, refusing to leave until the vote was cast. Ponsonby watched, his hands clammy, as Victoria sent for 4 key members of Parliament, 2 influential Whigs who were leaning toward Gladstone's anti-spending sentiment, and 2 Tory waverers who feared the Prince Arthur scandal. One by one, they were ushered into the small chamber. Victoria did not plead or appeal to their patriotism. She spoke to their futures. To the Whigs, she did not mention the Russian threat. Instead, she presented the authenticated and now secured ledgers from Constantinople. She revealed that Lord Pembroke, their supposed ally for reform, was using his shipping monopoly to intentionally raise the cost of grain imports to London, artificially inflating the price of bread in the city's poorest districts, a fact that would destroy their political base if exposed. "Do you wish your political careers to sink, gentlemen?" she asked them calmly, "with a traitor who starves the poor for his own profit?" To the Tory waverers, she pulled out a copy of a confidential medical assessment of Prince Arthur's health, manufactured by her personal physician. She hinted, with practiced ambiguity, that the prince's indiscretion was being dealt with by the family, and that any public scandal resulting from the vote's failure would be attributed directly to the nobleman's blackmail, a revelation that would drag their own aristocratic families through the mud. "You will support the crown, or you will find your own family histories open to the scrutiny of the press, gentlemen." It was ruthless, quiet, and absolutely effective. Victoria was not dictating policy. She was manipulating fear and self-preservation. She was trading political survival for the empire's survival. As the morning wore on, Victoria knew her political gamble was running parallel to the lethal gamble being taken thousands of miles away. At that very moment, under the command of the Raven, Operation Iron Hand was underway. The small envoy of Gurkha and Sikh specialists, having made a grueling forced march across the Afghan mountains, reached the coast gap just as the sun broke over the Hindu Kush. They found the pass lightly held by the nobleman's tribal proxies, who were confident in their surprise victory. The Raven, using his decades of field experience, ordered a precision strike using minimal explosives to collapse the narrowest, most critical choke point of the pass. They did not engage in a drawn-out battle, they executed a demolition. The pass was blocked, buying the Empire the crucial time needed to send official reinforcements. Before the enemy could rally, the Raven sent his single coded message: "Iron Hand secured. Gap closed." The coded telegram reached Ponsonby in the Speaker's chamber moments before the division bells rang for the final vote in the House of Commons. Ponsonby waited for the perfect moment. As Disraeli concluded his magnificent, emotionally charged speech, appealing to the glory of the Empire and the honor of the British soldier, the Prime Minister sat down to a thunderous but still divided chamber. Just as Gladstone rose to launch his expected devastating attack, Ponsonby discreetly signaled Disraeli. The Prime Minister, reading the confirmation of the Raven's success in Ponsonby's eyes, changed course. Instead of allowing Gladstone to speak, Disraeli dramatically read a brief, official-sounding dispatch, citing newly confirmed intelligence that a swift, decisive military action had been taken on the frontier that morning, securing the gap and nullifying the immediate threat. The effect was instantaneous. The opposition's argument that the funds were being voted for an already lost cause crumbled. The wavering members, influenced by Victoria's quiet threats and reassured by the sudden decisive military victory, turned. The vote was called. When the results were announced, the Imperial funding bill passed with a narrow but powerful majority. Victoria, listening to the muffled cheer from the chamber below, gave Ponsonby a single, curt nod. The political war was won. Lord Pembroke had lost his financial ability to manipulate the conflict. The Queen, however, had one final silent score to settle with the nobleman. She knew securing the vote was only half the victory. The other half was confronting the traitor himself.
Lord Alistair Pembroke, a man who believed in the absolute power of wealth and anonymity, woke to the crushing reality of his defeat. The Imperial funding bill had passed. The coast gap, according to the official and false reports, had been secured by a daring, swift response, nullifying his most devastating move. His financial manipulation had been exposed by the Queen in Westminster, leaving his political allies disgraced and rudderless. He attempted to retreat to his private estate, believing the worst consequence would be a massive financial loss and a period of political exile. He did not anticipate the speed or the intimacy of the Queen's final move. The Raven, having returned from his mission and now working with the full authority of the Crown, intercepted Pembroke's personal secretary in London. The secretary, a timid man who folded instantly under the threat of public ruin, revealed Pembroke's immediate travel plans. The nobleman was not returning to London. He was fleeing to his most remote estate, a small defensible manor on the Isle of Wight, near Osborne House, the Queen's private, secluded retreat. Victoria, upon receiving this intelligence, saw her opportunity. She would not allow Pembroke to be apprehended by police. A public arrest of a peer of the realm on charges of treason and conspiracy would create the exact national scandal she had worked so hard to avert. The trial, with its sensational details of royal debt and Foreign Office corruption, would tear the fabric of trust she had just begun to mend. She commanded the royal yacht Victoria and Albert to ferry her and Ponsonby across the Solent. The meeting would be private, swift, and entirely outside the purview of the law. Pembroke was apprehended by two of the Raven's former Gurkha specialists, who were waiting silently at the manor. They did not touch him, they merely blocked his escape routes, presenting him with a note on Queen stationery. Her Majesty requests the pleasure of your company at Osborne House, immediately. Lord Pembroke was ushered into the Queen's private study at Osborne House, a room overlooking the grey, churning sea. The air was heavy with the scent of wood smoke and the quiet certainty of final judgment. Victoria was seated behind her desk, wearing the relentless black dress, her figure unmoving, framed by the portrait of Albert. Ponsonby stood to one side, holding a leather dispatch case. No police, no guards, just the Queen, her secretary, and the traitor. Pembroke, a man used to commanding rooms, attempted to rally his arrogance. Your Majesty, I demand to know the meaning of this illegal detention. I have committed no treasonable act. I merely advocated for economic efficiency and necessary reform. Victoria raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. You confuse reform with ruin, Lord Pembroke. You confuse efficiency with mass murder. You attempted to destroy my Prime Minister, disgrace my son, and sacrifice my Indian garrisons, all to secure a monopoly on the trade of tea and opium. That is not reform. That is the depraved ambition of a cheap criminal. Ponsonby opened the dispatch case and laid out the evidence. The authenticated Constantinople ledgers, showing the Nobleman's shipping company funding the Russian-backed rebels. The signed notarized testimony of Elias Thorne, detailing the Nobleman's sabotage of Foreign Office cables. The official documentation of Prince Arthur's acquired debt, proving the Nobleman's personal blackmail attempt. A signed letter from the Viceroy, confirming the Coast Gap attack was paid for with untraceable gold coin. Victoria leaned forward, her eyes fixed on his. This evidence, Lord Pembroke, is sufficient to send you to the Tower. The subsequent trial would result in the forfeiture of your assets, the stripping of your title, and your execution for high treason. The scandal would rock the foundations of this nation for a decade. Pembroke's bravado finally shattered. The color drained from his face as he stared at the meticulous, damning collection of papers. He was not facing a government that could be bribed or outmaneuvered. He was facing the cold, implacable memory of the Crown. I only wish to know one thing, Your Majesty, he whispered, defeated. Who exposed me? Who found me? You underestimated me, sir, Victoria replied, her voice filled with quiet scorn. You believed my grief had dulled my mind. You relied on the incompetence of my ministers. You forgot that the Queen of England commands resources that are not visible on the balance sheets of Parliament,
men who operate solely on the principle of loyalty, not profit. She pushed a single document across the table. It was not evidence, but a contract. You will write a full confession, addressed only to me, detailing your conspiracy and naming every political accomplice. In return, I shall allow you to retain your life. You will divest yourself of every asset tied to the eastern trade routes, all your shipping lines, rail investments, and monopolies, transferring them to a Crown-sanctioned trust. You will leave the British Isles tonight on a vessel of your choosing, and you will never return. If you ever, for a single moment, violate the terms of your perpetual silent exile, this case will be reopened, and your reputation will be destroyed. Pembroke stared at the offer. Exile, humiliation, and financial ruin were preferable to the hangman's noose and eternal disgrace. He realized Victoria was allowing him to live not out of mercy, but out of self-preservation. She wanted silence more than vengeance. He picked up the pen, his hand shaking, and began to sign the end of his life in England. Victoria watched him, the Iron Queen satisfied not with blood, but with the utter, crushing destruction of her enemy's ambition. The empire was safe, and the great scandal was averted. The final cost, however, was yet to be fully calculated.
The immediate relief that swept through Whitehall following the passage of the Imperial Funding Bill felt like a cheap masquerade to Queen Victoria. The public, reassured by the official narrative of a decisive military response and the swift, quiet departure of the disgraced Lord Pembroke, who was merely cited as having severe financial mismanagement, settled back into complacency. The crisis, as far as the world knew, was over. But at Osborne House, the silence was heavy with the true cost of victory. Victoria sat in her study, the room still smelling faintly of Pembroke's panic and the Raven's damp wool coat. On her desk lay 3 objects: the signed confession detailing every act of treason, the transfer documents for Pembroke's vast shipping empire, and a telegram from Constantinople confirming the public ruin of Mr. James Hawthorne. She had protected the empire, but the methods had been ruthless. She had orchestrated the professional and personal destruction of a young, loyal agent, Hawthorne, to save a strategic ledger. She had allowed her son's reputation, Prince Arthur, to be temporarily sullied and forced his exile to buy a handful of days. And she had traded a traitor's justice, Pembroke's execution, for the Crown's secrecy and stability. Ponsonby entered, moving quietly, holding a glass of sherry he knew she would refuse. "The Raven is gone, ma'am," he reported, his voice low. "He left a brief note. He is retiring once more. He said the work is finished and the price paid was sufficient." Victoria nodded slowly. The Raven, D.G., was a mirror of her own necessity, a man willing to do the morally repellent work required for the greater good. His final departure was a reminder that such ruthlessness was a lonely undertaking. "And Lord Pembroke?" Victoria asked. "His yacht sailed from Southampton at midnight. He is gone to Montevideo. The trust is established. The Crown now possesses considerable assets in the Eastern trade, managed anonymously. It is a vast fortune, Your Majesty." "The Crown does not need more money, Henry," Victoria replied, her eyes distant. "It needed fewer traitors. Use the funds to discreetly settle Arthur's true debt, the debt owed to my reputation, not the debt owed to Pembroke. The public must believe the family handled the matter privately, not that a traitor attempted to exploit us." She picked up the telegram regarding Hawthorne. The young man, stripped of his position, was now an outcast in Constantinople, having been framed for a diplomatic scandal. Victoria knew he would spend the rest of his life in obscurity, forever believing he was betrayed by a hypocritical system. "Draft a private letter to the Viceroy, Ponsonby. A substantial, secret stipend for Mr. Hawthorne, paid quarterly into a private Swiss account.
Call it restitution for service. Ensure the money is untraceable to London and that he never knows who pays it. His reputation is lost, but his financial dignity must be restored. It is the least the Crown owes him. The greatest political risk lay in the exposure of Colonel Hastings and Lady Sybil, the civilian elements of the network. Victoria tasked Ponsonby to quietly dismantle the network, ensuring every loose end was tied and every contact was paid and thanked. Hastings was formally appointed the head archivist of the Balmoral Library, a harmless but prestigious position that gave him a lifetime pension. Lady Sybil received the Queen's personal thanks and a lucrative, anonymous royal donation to her soldiers' charity, a subtle, permanent acknowledgement of her invaluable service. As the sun set over the Isle of Wight, Victoria retired to her chambers. She stood before Albert's portrait, the ghost of her beloved husband's moral rectitude haunting the room. "I have saved your empire, Albert," she murmured, "but I did so by discarding the morality you prized. I have been ruthless. I have lied to Parliament, sacrificed an honest man, and allowed a traitor to live. I have made myself the thing they fear, not the thing they love." She felt the profound weight of her sovereignty. She was no longer the grieving widow, the sentimental relic of an earlier age. She was the absolute, final defense of a vast, complex machine. The political world wanted her to be a symbol. She had demonstrated she was the engine. She had fought this war alone, in the shadows, using her own resources and her own will. The experience had hardened her. She saw the politicians, the Disraelis, the Gladstones, the Derbys, not as partners, but as necessary, often careless employees. She knew with chilling certainty that the next threat would not come from abroad, but from within the ranks of her own ministers, men too arrogant or too blind to see the rot beneath the silk and stone of Westminster. The greatest lesson of the crisis was that the empire required an iron queen, one willing to cross the lines of legality and decency if it meant securing the structure of power. She had won the battle, but she had lost a piece of her soul in the process.
The years that followed the crisis of the Afghan frontier and the dismantling of Lord Pembroke's conspiracy were, for the public, an age of imperial resurgence. Disraeli, emboldened by the Queen's quiet, formidable support, leveraged the successfully passed funding bill to solidify Britain's presence in India, neutralizing the immediate Russian threat and declaring Victoria Empress of India in a move that publicly cemented the Crown's renewed power. Gladstone, having been subtly discredited by Victoria's private maneuvering regarding Pembroke's corrupt financial dealings, was forced into a period of frustrating political silence, unable to challenge the government without risking his own integrity. The official narrative of the Coast Gap Resolution was one of magnificent British military efficiency. No one ever connected the sudden surgical success to a small private envoy led by a ghost agent. No one ever linked the disgraced Foreign Office clerk in Constantinople or the exiled Prince Arthur to the treason of one of the richest men in England. The secrecy held absolute. For Queen Victoria, the crisis was not an end, but a beginning. It marked the definitive moment when the sentimental widow was replaced entirely by the formidable sovereign. She had learned that the mechanisms of governance, parliament, ministries, and the official channels of law were too slow, too prone to corruption, and too vulnerable to partisan infighting to ensure the survival of the empire. Only the silent, absolute authority of the Crown could guarantee security. She never fully trusted a minister again. Her private council remained small, consisting only of Sir Henry Ponsonby and, in his later years, his successor. Her relationship with her government became an exercise in careful delegation and quiet surveillance. When a policy required a particularly sensitive or quick execution, she did not rely on the Foreign Office.
she utilized the remnants of the widow's network. The nobleman's fortune, transferred into the crown's private trust, became her shadow budget. Managed in secret by Ponsonby, this vast, untraceable fund gave Victoria unprecedented financial leverage. It was not used for personal enrichment, but for the empire's silent needs, funding intelligence operations in volatile regions, securing the loyalty of minor colonial officials with unexpected grants, and quietly compensating those who, like Mr. James Hawthorne, had been sacrificed on the altar of state necessity. Hawthorne, living out his quiet exile in Switzerland, never learned the truth of his disgrace, but the regular substantial deposits of restitution for service ensured he lived in comfort and security. Prince Arthur, rehabilitated after his period of ill health, never again ventured near a risky investment, having learned the painful lesson that his mother's protection came with the highest price of personal sacrifice. Years passed. Disraeli died. Gladstone returned to power, only to find the Crown's resolve harder than ever. The political battles continued, but Queen Victoria now fought them with the absolute assurance that she possessed the ultimate veto, the secret knowledge of every man's weakness, secured by the network she could activate with a single cipher. She often returned to Balmoral, standing by the lough where she had made the coldest decisions of her life. She would recall the sight of Lord Pembroke, broken, signing away his future, and the necessary ruthlessness required to save the empire from its own internal corruption. By the turn of the century, Queen Victoria was an elderly woman, a symbol of stability known universally as the grandmother of Europe. Her public image was one of unwavering moral certitude and unwavering grief for Albert. Yet, in the solitude of her private chambers, she knew the truth. The memory of the Crown's moral rectitude, the standard set by Albert, had been essential for building the empire, but its survival demanded something colder, the pragmatic, amoral power of the state, wielded by an absolute sovereign. She had lied, manipulated, and betrayed, not for personal power, but to protect the legacy she cherished. The Queen had saved the empire not from the armies of the Tsar, but from the greed of her own noblemen and the well-meaning incompetence of her own government. She had traded the warmth of her own humanity for the cold, unyielding strength of the Iron Crown. Her final, defining legacy was not her public pomp, but the absolute secrecy with which she governed. The widow's network, activated only once in desperation, remained dormant but ready, a loaded weapon perpetually aimed at the heart of any future treason. The Iron Queen had learned that sometimes the only way to save the soul of a nation was to sacrifice a piece of her own, and she did not regret the price paid.